He hadn't cried since Kandahar, not at the funeral, not when his best friend was taken by an IED, not even when he came home to a life that no longer felt like his. But the morning Daniel Cross held a velvet pouch in his hands, the last thing tying him to the man who raised him, something inside broke. A silver star tucked away for decades, a war story never told, and a pawnshop owner whose trembling hands revealed a truth 70 years buried. This isn't just a story about war. It's about a legacy rediscovered, a debt finally repaid, and a quiet act of heroism that rippled through generations. Daniel came looking for money. What he found was a past that saved his future, and a promise that refused to die in silence. Daniel Cross stepped into the dusty old pawn shop, clutching a small velvet pouch as though it held his very soul. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. "I need the money," he said, barely above a whisper. His voice carried no anger, no resentment, just weariness. Behind the counter, the elderly shopkeeper glanced up. She was in her early 70s, maybe older. Her gray hair was tied into a no-nonsense bun, and she wore thick glasses that had slid halfway down her nose. She reached out without a word, opening the pouch and letting its contents spill gently into her palm. The metal caught the light for a second. Then she turned it over and read the name engraved on the back. Her entire body went still. A pallor washed over her face, and without a single word, she disappeared into the back of the store. Daniel stood frozen, unsure of what to make of her reaction. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, like it knew exactly what had just been handed over. 10 minutes later, the woman returned, her hands trembling now too. In one of them, she held a faded black and white photograph. Her cheeks were wet with tears. She placed the photo gently on the counter, her eyes never leaving Daniel's. "This man," she said, voice cracking, "he saved my life during the war." Some stories aren't just about the past. Some stories are debts that time refuses to erase, promises that wait decades to be fulfilled. Daniel Cross, 33 years old, former infantry soldier. He hadn't cried since Kandahar, not at the funeral of his best friend, not when the Humvee exploded and silence replaced a dozen familiar voices, not even when he came home and realized the war hadn't stayed behind. It had followed him, settling deep inside his chest like cement, cold and immovable. But this morning was different. 3 overdue bills lay spread across his kitchen table. The fridge hummed emptily in the background. A final eviction notice, folded and worn, rested under his chipped coffee mug. And Daniel, he sat at the edge of his bed with the velvet pouch in hand, staring down at it until something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. The metal inside the pouch wasn't just any metal. It was the silver star, the one that had once gleamed from inside his grandfather's desk drawer. Henry Cross, World War II veteran, a man of few words, fewer stories. He never really spoke of the war, just fragments here and there, half-finished sentences that trailed into silence, always followed by a slow shake of the head and a quiet sip of black coffee. Still, Daniel had always known it mattered. You didn't wrap something in velvet unless it meant something. And now it was all he had left of the man who taught him to fish, to change a tire, to walk tall, even when no one was looking. But pride didn't cover the rent. Daniel zipped up his worn field jacket, its edges fraying, and stepped out into the drizzle. Larchwood was quiet in the mornings, a small, sleepy town. No one asked questions here. People just nodded as they passed, like grief was a thing best left untouched. He walked 3 blocks, his boots splashing in shallow puddles, to the only place that might give him something, anything in return. Rose's Relics, a narrow little pawn shop sandwiched between a closed-down barbershop and a tax service that looked like it hadn't seen a customer since the late 80s. The bell above the door jingled softly as Daniel stepped in. Warm light spilled across the cluttered room, rows of antique clocks, dusty shelves packed with forgotten instruments, glass cases filled with old war memorabilia, polished silverware, and tiny treasures that once meant something to someone. The place smelled of wood polish and time. The woman behind the counter didn't look up right away. She was inspecting a pocket watch, carefully rotating it between her fingers with a reverence that reminded Daniel of the way his grandfather used to carve duck decoys. Deliberate, focused, gentle. "I'll be right with you," she murmured. Daniel gave a slow nod, though she hadn't seen him. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and wandered the shop. The quiet wrapped around him like a blanket, not warm, but not cold either, just steady. Still, it didn't make what he was about to do any easier. His fingers brushed the velvet pouch again inside his jacket pocket. It felt heavier today, like it knew. 6 months ago, Daniel had filed a claim with the VA. He said he was struggling to hold down work. Said the nightmares came back whenever the power went out. Since then, 4 more letters had arrived, all saying the same thing: under review, delayed, additional documentation required. He'd served 2 tours, bled for his country, and now not even the local hardware store would return his call. Finally, the woman looked up. "What can I help you with today?" Daniel stepped forward, his jaw clenched. The velvet pouch still rested in his fist. "I need to sell something," he said softly but clearly. She didn't flinch. "That's why people come in." But even as she spoke, something shifted in her eyes. She could see it. This wasn't just a transaction. This wasn't about money. It was about what it meant to let go of the last thread tying a man to the person he used to be. And Daniel was about to let it go. Rose Alcott had been behind that counter for over 40 years. She'd seen desperation before. It came in many forms: old guitars from failed dreams, wedding rings from broken vows, pocket watches etched with names people no longer dared say aloud. People didn't come to pawn shops with joy in their pockets. They came with weight. But this man, there was something different about him, something sacred. And she felt it before she even looked inside that pouch. What she didn't yet know was that fate, dusty and forgotten like the shelves around her, had just walked back into her shop. And some debts, no matter how old, never stopped waiting to be repaid. There was something different about him. Rose could feel it before he even spoke. She watched his hands carefully, hands worn and calloused from years of labor, but trembling just enough to betray something deeper. Maybe nerves, or grief, or reverence. He reached into his coat pocket with a kind of hesitant care, like he was about to handle something fragile or sacred. What he pulled out wasn't large, but it held weight. A small navy velvet pouch, worn at the edges, frayed a little near the drawstrings. He held it like it might vanish if he let it go too fast. With quiet purpose, he placed it on the glass counter between them. The air seemed to shift slightly, just a degree heavier. "I'm not even sure what it's worth," the man, Daniel, said, his voice low and unsure. Rose didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved instinctively, reverently. With both hands, she reached for the pouch, not like a dealer, but like a priestess lifting a relic. She loosened the drawstring and tilted it slowly over her open palm. A dull silver glint emerged. Even aged, scratched by time, and a little tarnished, the five-pointed shape caught the light from under the counter. A silver star. Rose didn't need to read the engraving. She knew what it was the moment it touched her skin. Valor in the face of enemy fire. She had only ever seen one in person, and that was behind glass in a museum. This one was real, heavy, intimate. It had lived in someone's pocket, not a display case. She lifted it gently, turned it in her hand. Then she read the back. H. Cross, 1944. Everything stilled. Her breath hitched involuntarily. Her back straightened, as if someone had yanked a thread along her spine. Her hands, which just moments before had moved with practiced calm, now trembled slightly under the weight. Not of metal, but of memory. Daniel saw the shift. "Is something wrong?" he asked cautiously. Rose didn't answer. Not yet. Not like this. She clutched the metal to her chest suddenly, protectively. "Excuse me a moment," she whispered. She turned swiftly, surprisingly fast for a woman her age, and disappeared through the swinging wooden door at the back of the shop. Daniel was left standing alone in a silence that felt almost sacred. The small brass bell above the front door still swayed from her passing, a faint chime hanging in the air like an unanswered question. He looked around, unsettled. Did she think it was fake? Stolen? Was there something wrong with the name? He hadn't done anything wrong. That metal had lived in his family for decades. His grandfather never sold it, never wore it, never even talked about it. It just stayed there, tucked away in a drawer, inside that little velvet pouch, as though it didn't want to be remembered, as though it was waiting. And now, somehow, it had reached across time and touched this stranger like a bolt of lightning. From behind the wall, he could hear the faint sounds of movement, drawers opening, boxes being pulled from shelves. There was a quiet urgency to it, the rustle of someone chasing a ghost. He shifted on his feet. Should he leave? Wait? But something in the air, something solemn and still, held him in place. He couldn't move. Not yet. 10 minutes passed, or maybe it was only 5. It felt like an hour. Just as he turned slightly, preparing to walk toward the door, it creaked open again. Rose reappeared, eyes rimmed in red. Her hands were shaking, but she wasn't empty-handed. In her arms, she held a small wooden box and something wrapped in an old linen cloth, the kind that yellows with age but holds its shape like it's been folded with care for decades. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice soft but it's certain. She laid the cloth-wrapped object down on the counter and turned it so the frame installed faced away from him. "Was your grandfather's full name Henry Cross?" Daniel blinked. "Yes. Henry Thomas Cross. Why?" Without speaking, Rose gently turned the photograph around. The frame was worn, a corner chipped, but the photo had clearly been loved, cared for. Black and white, faded slightly at the edges, but still sharp where it mattered. A young American soldier stood at the center, probably no older than 20. His uniform was pressed but dusty. One hand rested lightly on the shoulder of a little girl, no more than 10 years old. Her hair was tangled, her dress was too large, sleeves rolled up clumsily. She clutched a stuffed bear, one ear missing. Behind them stood ruins, broken stone, scorched timber, maybe once a school or a chapel. Now nothing but rubble. But it was the expression on the soldier's face that made Daniel stop breathing. That smile, not big, just a hint, crooked, humble. The same one Daniel remembered from the single photo his family had of his grandfather during the war. The slight tilt of his head, the softness in his eyes, heavy with something too old for his age. Daniel leaned in. "That's him," he whispered. "That's my grandfather." His gaze shifted to the girl in the photo. "And that's you," he added. Rose nodded slowly. Her voice came back, gentler now. "Yes," she took a breath. "I was born in a small village outside Caen in Normandy," she said, almost like she was telling a story to herself. "My parents were part of the resistance. They passed messages to Allied forces, smuggled food through the woods, hid radios under the floorboards." She trailed off, her fingers moving over the wooden box she had carried from the back. She opened it slowly, revealing a scattering of history, a child's ration card, a folded armband with a faded tricolor, and a pressed flower sealed between wax paper. She looked up at Daniel. "Your grandfather saved us. And today, that little girl finally has a chance to return the kindness that saved her life." The photograph trembled in Daniel's hand as if the weight of the moment had suddenly multiplied. He glanced down at the photo again, an old black and white image of a man in uniform, young and stern-eyed, a metal cross pinned to his chest. His grandfather, a man who'd never spoken of the war, never bragged, never once hinted at what he had done that night so long ago. The folded map on the counter was brittle with age, its edges frayed, pencil lines still faintly visible tracing routes through the French countryside. Next to it lay a French identity document from 1944. The name faded, but the fear and urgency it represented still palpable in every fold. Rose's eyes glistened with tears that hadn't quite fallen. Her hands, still steady despite the years, clutched the counter with quiet resolve. "When the Americans came through in August, we thought the war was ending. We let our guard down." Her voice faltered, then tightened. "But the Germans returned." Daniel's breath caught. "They had lists. My parents' names were on them. That night, they had gone to meet others in the next village. I was left home, alone with just one American soldier assigned to watch the house." Her voice softened with memory. "Private Cross." Daniel's gaze shot up, stunned. "I remember his voice," Rose said, barely more than a whisper. "Calm, quiet. He heard the German trucks before I did. He pulled me from my bed, carried me like I weighed nothing, and tucked me under the floorboards. Then he said, 'Don't move. no matter what you hear." She gripped the edge of the counter tighter, her knuckles white. I heard them yelling, then gunfire. He ran out the front to draw them away. Her breath trembled. I lay there for hours, paralyzed. I thought he was dead. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. But the next morning the Americans returned. They said one of their men had lured the Germans into a patrol ambush. Saved the village. She paused, eyes distant. He was wounded, but alive. Daniel blinked rapidly, unable to speak. "He never told us," he finally managed, voice hoarse. "Not one word." Rose offered a gentle, knowing smile. "He wouldn't have. Men like him rarely do." She reached across the counter and laid her hand over his. It was warm, steady, anchoring. "For 70 years I've wondered who he was. I never knew his first name, just Cross. I searched it everywhere, every archive, every veteran's list. But your grandfather disappeared from the records after the war. No trace," she exhaled shakily. "So I made a promise to myself. If I ever found him or his family, I would repay the debt." Daniel opened his mouth, but no sound came. The weight of her words silenced everything else. Rose's voice grew stronger, more grounded. "That medal doesn't belong in a display case, and it doesn't belong in a pawn shop drawer either." She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "It belongs with someone who understands what it meant, what he did." Daniel slowly sank onto the nearby stool, the photo still clutched in his fingers like a lifeline. He had come to this shop expecting a transaction, something quick and impersonal, something necessary. Now it felt like sacred ground. Rose closed the wooden box with care and placed it beside the photograph. Then, from beneath the counter, she drew out a thick envelope, yellowed with age, sealed and clearly cherished. "For 20 years, she said quietly, I kept a separate account at the bank. It wasn't much at first, just a little here and there when the shop did well. I never touched it." Daniel looked at the envelope, confused. "Why?" Her eyes locked onto his. "Because when I was 10, hiding under floorboards, I made a promise. I told myself that if I ever saw that soldier again, or his family, I'd repay what could never truly be repaid." He pushed the envelope gently back toward her. "Miss Alcott, I can't take this. That was something he did, not me." She didn't blink. "You're wrong." Her voice was unwavering now, firm with conviction. "Your grandfather didn't save me because he expected anything in return. He didn't know what I would become. He didn't know I'd end up owning a shop in a quiet American town. But he saved me anyway." She leaned closer, eyes locking onto his. "And now his grandson, his legacy, is sitting in front of me, about to pawn the very symbol of what he stood for. That cross proves he lived for something bigger than himself." She slid the envelope back toward him. "This isn't a gift. It's not charity. It's the settlement of a debt I've carried in my heart for 70 years. Daniel's throat tightened. His eyes dropped to the envelope and then to the metal, gleaming faintly in the shop's warm light. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally his voice broke. "He never told me. Not once. Never said he was a hero." Rose smiled, bittersweet and proud. "The real ones never do." She stood, her joints creaking slightly, and walked over to a small safe tucked into the corner. The lock clicked open. When she returned, she handed him a cream-colored card. "I want you to call this number tomorrow," she said. "It's for a group called Veterans United. My husband served on their board before he passed. They help people like you, descendants of veterans, folks struggling with the weight of legacy, find the support they deserve." Daniel turned the card in his hand, still reeling. "Why are you doing this?" Rose's eyes softened. "Because 70 years ago, a stranger gave everything to save a little girl who had no one. And today, that little girl finally gets the chance to say thank you." Daniel Cross stood at the front of the room, the hum of the fluorescent lights above barely masking the rustle of jackets and the soft clinks of coffee cups. A few heads nodded, some leaned forward, just a little. He swallowed and went on. "That's why I'm here. Because that story, his story, didn't end with him. It lives on in me now. And maybe, just maybe, it lives on in all of us." He paused, glancing down at the velvet pouch cradled in his hands. The silver star inside was still cool to the touch, but somehow it felt warmer now, like it had absorbed the weight of every memory, every truth, every moment that had brought him to this place. I spent months waiting on paperwork that never came, he said quietly. Felt like I was screaming into a void. The VA lost my file. No one returned my calls. I was out of work, out of money, and out of hope. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't look away. Then I walked into a pawn shop, just trying to sell what I had left. I thought I was letting go of something I didn't deserve to keep, but that's when I met Rose. A murmur of recognition passed through the group. Most of them knew someone like her, someone who didn't wear a uniform, but still fought for people like them every day. She didn't just give me back a medal, Daniel said. She gave me back a piece of myself. She reminded me that legacy isn't some dusty memory. It's a responsibility. And she didn't stop there. She gave me a card, a name, a chance. He looked at the group and smiled for the first time. That's why I'm here today. Not just to talk, but to listen, to learn, to rebuild. From the back of the room, a man in a faded USMC cap raised his cup in quiet salute. Another tapped his cane twice against the linoleum floor in approval. Daniel stepped away from the front and took his seat again, his hands still resting protectively over the pouch in his lap. He didn't need applause or praise. What he needed, what he'd found, was something far greater: connection. After the meeting, a few veterans approached him, sharing their own stories in hushed voices, offering contact info, suggestions, encouragement. They spoke of years lost to silence, of battles never filed in any report. And they spoke of healing, slow, uneven, but real. Later that day, Daniel sat across from Rose again, this time at a cafe near the edge of town. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the silver thread in her hair. I did what you asked, he said, stirring his coffee. I called, I went in, they saw me right away. Turns out my file was buried under the wrong name. Took all of 10 minutes to fix. Rose gave a knowing smile. It usually does, once someone bothers to look. And your nephew, Daniel continued, he offered me a position, said I'd start next month, full-time. That's good, she said simply. You'll be good at it. You've got the kind of steadiness people trust. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed the photo on the table between them, the one with his grandfather and the little girl. I don't know her name, he murmured, but she changed everything, for both of us. Rose studied the image, her fingertips gently brushing the corner of the photo. She's the reason he never stopped trying. And now she's the reason you didn't either. Daniel sat back, the noise of the cafe washing around them like distant surf. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt a sense of quiet inside. Not absence, not emptiness, but peace. When he returned home that evening, he carefully removed the silver star from its pouch and placed it in a small frame, along with the photo. He set it on a shelf above his desk, not as decoration, but as a reminder of courage, of family, of the moment one man's legacy became another man's beginning. And as the evening sun cast golden light across the floorboards, Daniel Cross sat at his desk, opened his notebook, and began to write, not about war, but about resilience, kindness, and the quiet power of remembering. Daniel stood before the circle of chairs, his voice calm but filled with something deeper: purpose. I'm starting something called Path of Honor, he began. It's not therapy, it's not a lecture, it's a chance for each of us to bring in something from our past. A medal, a photo, a letter, anything that reminds you of who you are and why you're still here. In the front row, an older man with a cane raised his hand, his brow furrowed with skepticism but tinged with curiosity. You mean like show and tell for soldiers? Daniel smiled, warm and knowing. Exactly. But instead of kids showing off baseball cards, we're reminding each other of what we've lived through, and maybe what we've still got to give. He hadn't expected much that day, maybe a few polite nods or a shrug, but what followed in the next hour would shape everything. A Korean War veteran slowly stood and pulled out an old creased telegram from his wallet, the paper worn thin, the edges frayed. He had carried it since 1953. A Vietnam medic, hands slightly trembling, unwrapped a blood-stained field dressing. It had been tucked in the bottom of her drawer for decades, not kept out of morbidity, but out of reverence. The fabric was faded, but the memory was vivid. And Daniel, he shared something deeply personal, a letter Rose had found behind an old photo frame. It was from his grandfather, written to a little French girl during World War II. The words were gentle, full of hope, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, people still found each other. Word of the gathering spread. What had started with 5 veterans and a few memories turned into something more. A community began to grow. Every week more came. Strangers became companions, trauma softened by shared stories. Laughter returned to faces that hadn't smiled in years. Tears were no longer hidden. They were honored. A local newspaper did a story. Soon after, the city council offered a grant to expand the program. And every week, without fail, Rose was there. Always in the front row, always listening. Her hands folded neatly on her lap, the photograph of her younger self sitting beside her like a quiet witness to the passage of time. Through it all, Daniel began to realize something powerful. Legacy wasn't just what you inherited. It was what you chose to pass on. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was building something that would outlast him. The following month, Daniel arrived early at the Veterans Resource Center. The coffee was already brewing, the chairs arranged in a circle just like always. But today felt different. Maybe it was the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Maybe it was the buzz of anticipation from the volunteers. Or maybe it was because of who he had invited. Her name was Private Nena Ruiz. She had walked through the center's doors just the week before, fresh out of basic training. Her uniform was crisp, her boots still polished to perfection. She was quiet, unsure, clearly unfamiliar with the heritage sessions. But someone had whispered to her, "You should hear this guy Cross speak." She had listened that day, really listened. Daniel could see it in the way she held herself, alert yet open. So this time he'd asked her to come early. When she arrived, Daniel handed her a folded envelope. Inside was a fragile handwritten letter. "My grandfather wrote this 80 years ago," he said gently, "to a girl he didn't think would survive the night. But somehow she did. And somehow this letter made its way to me." He paused, watching the weight of the envelope settle in her hands. "We've started a new initiative," he continued, "a letter from each generation to the next. We're calling it the Letter Project." Elena looked up, her eyes wide. "You want me to write one?" Daniel nodded. "Not today. Not to me. Write it for the next you." She held the envelope to her chest like it was something sacred, something earned. That afternoon, the room was packed. Not just veterans anymore, but their families, their children, students from the nearby community college. People who had never worn a uniform, but came because they wanted to understand, to listen, to remember. As always, Rose sat in the front row. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. The photograph was beside her, unchanged. She had listened for years. But today, she would do more than listen. Daniel didn't lead the session this time. He simply stood, nodded, and introduced Elena. She stepped forward slowly. Her hands shook slightly, but her voice found its footing. She unfolded a fresh sheet of paper. Her words were new, written the night before. "To the soldier who comes after me," she began, "I don't know your name or where you'll serve, but I know the weight you'll carry, and I want you to know you are not alone." Silence fell over the room. Not a heavy silence, but one filled with meaning, with reverence. Then one by one, others stood. An aging Marine spoke of a promise he made to a brother in arms, a promise he had never been able to keep. A Gold Star mother stood with trembling hands and held up a dog tag that had been mailed back to her in a plain, unmarked envelope. It was all she had left of her son. And Rose, who had listened for so long, finally rose to her feet. This time, she told the full story, not just of how she survived the war, but how she rebuilt her life in the decades that followed. Through loneliness, through silence, through grief. And in that room filled with scars both visible and hidden, something unspoken passed between them all. Something fragile, something sacred. The unbroken chain of remembrance, carried forward, letter by letter, voice by voice. 6 months had passed since Daniel walked into that dusty pawn shop with a weight in his chest and a medal in his hand. He had gone in with the intention of pawning away the last piece of his history that still held meaning. A piece of silver shaped like a star, dulled by time but still bright enough to sting. Back then, he wasn't thinking about honor or legacy. He was thinking about survival, about letting go. But everything changed the moment he met her. Now, on the wall of the Veterans Resource Center, there was something new. A cork bulletin board hung proudly beneath a simple, handwritten sign that read, "Letters Forward." Beneath it were dozens of envelopes, already pinned in neat rows. Each one bore the same quiet directive: to the next one who needs this. The ripple had begun. That piece of forgotten metal, nearly lost to time in a pawnshop's clutter, had become a symbol, a spark that ignited something far greater than one man's past. It had become proof that courage doesn't fade with the years. It echoes forward, louder and stronger, with each person willing to carry it onward. The Heritage of Courage program now met twice a week. The bulletin board was never empty. Veterans, their families, and even strangers filled the wall with handwritten letters, each one a quiet lifeline tossed across the chasm of time. Words shared not for attention, but for connection. A bridge built from silence, memory, and honor. Daniel stood at the podium that morning in the same room that had once felt foreign to him. He wore a clean button-down shirt, but more importantly, he wore the same silver star, now polished, now worn over his heart. Not for decoration, not out of pride, but because that metal, once heavy with confusion, had become his compass. He glanced briefly at the notes in his hand, then raised his eyes to the small but attentive crowd. Veterans, students, community leaders, all gathered for the center's annual recognition event. His voice was calm, steady. 6 months ago, he began, I walked into a pawn shop ready to give up the last thing I owned that had meaning. I thought I was just trying to survive. He let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. But instead, I met someone who reminded me that legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you live up to. He turned toward the front row where Rose sat, still elegant, still strong, still holding the faded black and white photo of a young soldier and a little girl clinging to his hand. That little girl in the picture, she never forgot, Daniel said softly. Not when the bomb stopped falling, not when the years crept by. She held that memory close, waiting for the moment she could return the kindness. He took a deep breath and let his fingers brush against the star pinned to his chest. My grandfather never told that story, not to me, not to anyone. But somehow it found its way back, not through history books or monuments, but through people, through the quiet threads that connect us when we choose to care. After the ceremony and the reception hall filled with coffee cups and soft conversation, someone asked Daniel what he planned to do next. He didn't hesitate. Keep showing up, he replied. Keep listening. Keep passing it forward. Later that night, he drove Rose home. She rested a small wooden box on her lap, the same one she'd kept sealed for decades. Inside were pieces of a life lived through war and waiting, her wartime documents, ration cards, and one fragile yellowing letter, the one his grandfather had written to her when she was only 10 years old. At her doorstep, she turned to him with a gentle smile. You know, she said, for years I thought that medal was the end of the story. Daniel looked down at the star on his chest and answered quietly, turns out, it was just the beginning. He stepped back into the cool night air, a strange peace settling over him like a soft coat. Because some stories don't end with parades or headlines, some find their closing chapter in quiet living rooms, in handwritten letters passed from one hand to the next, and in small acts of remembrance no one ever sees. And some stories don't end at all. They echo, because true heroes aren't built in the spotlight. They're forged in silence and sacrifice, in the lives of those who choose to carry someone else's legacy without ever being asked. Some legacies don't need fireworks or fame to leave their mark. They endure in a medal tucked inside a drawer, in a black and white photo on a mantle, in a promise whispered under the floorboards in the darkest hours of war. Henry Cross never asked to be remembered. He didn't fight for glory. But because he chose courage without expectation, his legacy lived on, in a woman who never forgot and a grandson who nearly did. In today's fast-moving world, we forget too easily. We scroll past the stories that built the ground we stand on. We overlook the quiet strength of our elders, dismiss their silence as irrelevance. But what if the old man sipping coffee at the diner once stood between a child and death? What if the woman who walks with a cane once saved a family in a burning village? Legacy isn't about being known. It's about being passed on, wordlessly, often when no one's watching. Not for credit, but for love, for honor, and for the hope that someone, somewhere will pick it up and carry it just a little farther. It's about being there, truly being present when it counts, about stepping up in quiet, often unnoticed moments to remind someone that they matter, that their story matters, and that they are not forgotten. And so we want to ask you something from the heart. Has there ever been a time when you uncovered a family story that completely changed the way you saw someone you thought you already knew inside and out? Or maybe you met a person whose quiet past, the kind they never brag about, left you absolutely stunned. A war hero disguised as a janitor, a survivor wrapped in humility, a grandparent whose worn hands held decades of untold sacrifice. If something like that has happened in your life, we'd love for you to share it in the comments. These stories deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered, shared, and passed on, because every name carries a legacy, and every quiet act of courage adds something beautiful to the world. If you believe that no one should be forgotten, especially those who gave without ever asking for recognition, leave a comment with the word respect. It's a simple word, but it holds the weight of gratitude, memory, and truth. And if this story touched you, if it made you pause and feel something deeper, please take a moment to like the video. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notifications. We are committed to telling more true stories that honor dignity, silent sacrifice, and the quiet strength that so often goes unseen. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. And remember this, some of the greatest medals ever earned aren't worn on uniforms.